The lights dimmed slightly as Adir took a deep breath, gripping her violin with steady hands. This was more than just a performance. This was the moment she had fought for her entire life. The murmurs of the audience quieted as she stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice unwavering. "Good evening, judges and audience," she began. "My name is Adir, and tonight, I want to share my story through music." Her words carried weight, not just because of what she had endured, but because of what she represented. A girl from a small Indian village who had refused to let society dictate her dreams. Music had never been considered a path for someone like her. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing herself to go back to where it all started. A childhood full of dreams and struggles. Born into a humble home in a small Indian village, Adir grew up surrounded by the sounds of daily life, street vendors calling out their goods, the laughter of children playing, the rhythmic beats of traditional folk songs playing at village festivals. But among these sounds, the most beautiful to her was the sound of a violin. She first heard it when an old traveler passed through the village. The man, a musician, had played his violin in the village square, and Adir had stood mesmerized. The notes seemed to dance in the air, telling stories without words. She had never experienced anything so magical. Her heart ached for a violin of her own, but in a family struggling to afford even basic necessities, such a dream seemed impossible. She didn't dare ask her parents, knowing they had no extra money to spare. Still, the dream never left her. Her mother, however, saw the longing in her daughter's eyes. She noticed how Adir would mimic the motion of a violinist using a wooden stick, pretending to play invisible strings. She knew this was not just a child's passing fascination, it was a calling. Adir's mother, despite their hardships, began saving. Every spare coin she managed to keep aside went toward a secret goal: buying her daughter a violin. It took months and sometimes it meant skipping small comforts, but she never wavered. And one day, she presented Adir with a modest second-hand violin. Adir could hardly believe it. She ran her fingers over the smooth wood, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Tears welled in her eyes as she embraced her mother. It was more than just an instrument, it was a promise, a hope, a chance at something bigger than the life she had known. The first notes of a dream. She spent hours practicing, teaching herself by ear since there was no one in the village who could teach her. She imitated the sound she had once heard from the old traveler, experimenting with each note, allowing her fingers to find the right places on the strings. The village was skeptical. Some laughed at the idea of a girl playing an instrument, saying it was improper. Others told her to focus on chores and her future marriage, as music would bring her nothing. But Adir ignored them. She played in the small corners of her home, on the steps outside, anywhere she could find a moment of peace with her violin. Her mother's encouragement kept her going. "Let them talk," she had said. "One day they will listen." And she was right. Slowly, people started noticing her talent. At village gatherings, she was invited to play, even if it was just to entertain small crowds. But for Adir, it was everything. The violin became an extension of her soul, a language that spoke when words could not. However, life had another challenge in store for her. A young mother's struggles. At 16, Adir's life changed forever. She became a mother, something she had not planned, but something she embraced with the same determination that had fueled her music. But the world was not kind. People whispered that her dreams were over, that a girl with a child had no place in music. They told her she should focus only on raising her child, that the violin was a childish fantasy that needed to be forgotten. For a brief moment, she doubted herself. Holding her newborn in her arms, she wondered if the world was right. Was she selfish to still dream? But the first time she picked up her violin after becoming a mother, something inside her reignited. As she played, her child, only a few months old, looked up at her with innocent curiosity. It was in that moment that she realized she wasn't just playing for herself anymore. She was playing for her child's future. Every day she played, rocking her baby with one arm while drawing the bow across the strings with the other. Her music became her strength, her comfort, and her promise that she would not give up. She refused to let go of her passion, and with her baby beside her, she continued to play. First in small gatherings, then at weddings, and soon at village festivals. People who once doubted her now listened. They weren't just hearing music anymore. They were hearing her story. And now, years later, she stood on a grand stage in front of thousands, holding not just her violin, but everything she had fought for. She opened her eyes and took a deep breath. The moment had come. With a steady hand, she lifted her violin to her chin, closed her eyes and began to play. As Adir stepped onto the stage gripping her violin, a hush fell over the audience. This was more than just a performance. It was the culmination of every struggle she had endured. She took a deep breath and spoke. "Good evening, judges and audience. My name is Adir, and tonight, I want to share my story through music." Born in a small Indian village, music had never been considered a path for a girl like her. Her family struggled and opportunities were scarce, but her mother saw the spark in her eyes. Despite their hardships, her mother saved every spare coin to buy her a second-hand violin. When Adir held it for the first time, she felt an unbreakable bond with the instrument. It became her refuge, her voice in a world that often silenced girls with dreams. But life was never easy. At 16, she became a mother. The village whispered that her dreams were over, that a girl with a child had no place on a stage. For a moment she believed them. But as she looked at her child, she realized that she wasn't just playing for herself anymore. She played to create a future for both of them. Holding her baby in one arm and her violin in the other, she poured her emotions into the melodies, letting the music speak when words failed her. She played in secret at first, then at small gatherings and eventually at weddings and festivals. People who once doubted her now listened. They weren't just hearing music, they were hearing her story. Then an opportunity came that she never imagined. A man from the city, impressed by her playing at a festival, offered her a chance to audition for a prestigious music academy. The city was overwhelming, filled with towering buildings and fast-paced streets. The academy was intimidating, full of musicians who had trained under masters since childhood. Adir, a self-taught village girl, felt out of place. Some students whispered that she didn't belong, but she refused to let doubt consume her. Every night, after putting her child to sleep, she practiced relentlessly, learning, refining, and perfecting her craft. When her audition arrived, she played not to impress, but to share her journey. As the final note resonated, silence filled the room. Then the judges clapped. "You play from the soul," one of them said. "We would be honored to have you here." She had done it, she had earned her place. The academy was challenging, pushing her to limits she had never imagined. She learned music theory, studied advanced techniques, and adapted to a world far removed from the village where she had first fallen in love with music. Slowly, she gained the respect of her peers. Her determination was undeniable. Then came the Academy's annual performance, a grand event where only the best students were selected to play before elite musicians, critics, and talent scouts. When the final list was announced, her name was on it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The chance to prove that she was more than just a village girl with a dream. The night of the performance arrived. Standing backstage, she felt the weight of her journey pressing on her. She thought of her mother, of the sacrifices that had led her here. She thought of the nights spent playing lullabies to her child, of the voices that once told her she would never make it. Then she stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright. The hall was silent. Thousands of eyes watched her. She lifted her violin, took a deep breath, and played. And this time she wasn't just playing a song. She was playing her journey. As the final note of her performance echoed through the grand concert hall, Adir stood motionless, her violin still raised. The silence stretched for a moment, and then thunderous applause erupted. She had done it. This wasn't just music. It was her soul, her struggles, and her triumph laid bare for the world to hear. Tears welled in her eyes as she bowed, taking in the standing ovation before her. After the performance, she was approached by talent scouts and musicians who praised her unique ability to channel emotion through her violin. She was offered opportunities to perform in major cities, invitations to music collaborations, and even a scholarship for further studies. It felt like a dream, yet as she held the violin in her hands, she knew it was real. But success came with its own burdens. Touring meant being away from her child for long periods, and the thought of missing precious moments in his life filled her with guilt. She faced criticism from those who believed a mother should not chase personal ambitions. that she should be home instead of traveling the world with a violin. The whispers returned, but this time she knew how to silence them. She had worked too hard to let society's judgment decide her fate. She decided to take her son with her. It wasn't easy. Balancing motherhood and a demanding music career was a challenge most didn't understand. There were sleepless nights, endless flights, and moments when she questioned whether she was doing the right thing. But every time she saw him watching her perform, his tiny hands clapping with pride, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Her journey took her across the country. She played at prestigious venues, performed alongside renowned musicians, and shared her story on platforms that reached millions. People admired her resilience, and many young girls from small villages wrote to her, telling her that she had become their inspiration. For them, she was proof that dreams could defy limitations. One evening, after a performance in Mumbai, she received a letter that made her pause. It was from a woman in her village, someone who had once looked down on her for pursuing music. The letter spoke of how Adir's success had changed the way people viewed women in their community. More girls were now allowed to learn music, and mothers encouraged their daughters to chase their dreams. Her story had become bigger than just her own. It had sparked a movement. But amidst the growing fame, she never forgot her roots. The violin her mother had given her remained her most cherished possession, a reminder of where she started. She made it a point to return to her village, not as someone who had outgrown it, but as someone who wanted to give back. She organized music workshops for children, encouraging them to explore their talents without fear. She wanted to be the mentor she never had. As she stood in the village square, playing for the people who had once doubted her, she saw familiar faces in the crowd. Her mother stood among them, tears streaming down her face. The same village that once told her she had no place in music was now celebrating her. The whispers of doubt had turned into cheers of admiration. That night, as she tucked her son into bed, he looked up at her and said, "Mama, when I grow up, I want to play the violin like you." Adir smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Then you shall, my love. And I will teach you everything I know." She had traveled far, played on grand stages, and seen the world. But as she lay beside her child, listening to the distant sounds of the village she once called home, she realized something. This right here was her greatest performance yet, and the music would never stop. Years passed, but the music never stopped. Adir's journey had taken her to stages across the world, yet her heart always remained connected to where it all began. She had proven that dreams could rise from the smallest places, that talent and passion could break through the barriers of tradition and expectation. Her name became known not just as a violinist but as a symbol of perseverance, of a mother's love, and of the unyielding spirit of a woman who refused to be silenced. But even as her fame grew, she never allowed herself to forget why she played. Every note, every melody carried the weight of her struggles, her mother's sacrifices, and the hope she now gave to others. And now it was time to give back in a way that would last beyond just performances. She made the decision to open a music school in her village, a place where children, boys and girls alike, could learn without fear, where no dream was too big, and no background too small. With the support of donors who had been moved by her story, she built a modest yet beautiful academy, one where young musicians would find guidance, encouragement, and the chance she had never been given. The opening ceremony was emotional. She stood on the same ground where she had once been mocked for playing her violin, now surrounded by children holding instruments with eyes full of excitement and wonder. Her mother, now older but still radiating the same love and pride, stood beside her, watching as her daughter created something that would outlive even her music. As Adir took the stage to perform at the inauguration of the school, she felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. She had played in grand concert halls, but no performance had ever meant as much as this one. With her son standing beside her, now old enough to play alongside her, she lifted her violin and let the music flow, this time not just as a story of struggle, but as a song of triumph. Her village, the place that once doubted her, now echoed with the sounds of violins, flutes, and drums, with children laughing as they learned, with parents watching proudly. The change had begun, and she was the reason behind it. One evening after a long day of teaching, Adir sat outside her home, looking up at the stars. Her son, now growing into a talented musician himself, sat beside her. "Mama, did you ever think your music would bring you here?" he asked. She smiled, holding the violin that had started it all. "I never knew where my music would take me. I only knew that I could never stop playing." And as the wind carried the faint melody of children practicing in the distance, she realized that her journey, though filled with trials, had led her exactly where she was meant to be. The music would live on, in her son, in her students, in every child who picked up an instrument because they believed in the power of a dream. And Adir knew as long as there was music, she would always be playing her song.